Something is changing in America, and for those of us who have lived here our whole lives, we can feel it in our bones. On the surface, the stores are still open. But talk to anyone living on a fixed pension or Social Security. They won't talk about politics. They'll tell you their property taxes just doubled. Their car insurance jumped for absolutely no reason. They will tell you, with a tired resignation, that the country we worked so hard to build is quietly slipping away. Today, we are looking at 10 U.S. states that are silently collapsing from the inside out. There is no loud alarm, just a quiet, brutal financial pressure building year after year until the math simply stops working.
But talk to someone who has lived in the same city for 30 years. They won't start with politics. They'll tell you the grocery bill doubled. The car insurance jumped. No claims, no reason. Their kids can't afford to rent, let alone buy. And they'll say it with a tired resignation, like they know something shifted, they just can't point to when. Last year, over 771,000 Americans were homeless on a single night. More than 111 million were carrying credit card debt they couldn't fully pay off each month. And across large parts of this country, population growth has essentially stalled. There was no collapse, no alarm, just quiet pressure, building year after year, state after state, until one day the math stopped working. These are 10 states where it's already stopped. And the further down this list we go, the harder it gets to look away. Number 10. West Virginia, the state that is shrinking from the inside out. Start with one number, just one. In West Virginia, more people are dying each year than are being born. Not one bad year, not a pandemic spike. A sustained, ongoing trend that demographers now treat as a baseline. They call it natural decrease. What it means is this: even if outmigration stopped entirely tomorrow, the state would still be shrinking. On its own, from within. That is a different category of problem than anything else on this list. Decades of economic decline built around coal pushed younger residents out in search of work. The people who stayed tended to be older. Birth rates fell as the working-age population thinned. Over time, the demographic structure tilted so far toward aging that it could no longer replace itself. The effects are concrete. Schools consolidate and close. Hospitals carry more elderly patients with complex conditions while the tax base funding them shrinks. Local governments face the same impossible math every budget cycle: less revenue, more cost per resident, infrastructure built for a population that no longer fully exists. There's one more layer that usually gets left out. West Virginia has one of the highest rates of single adult homelessness in the country. Not families displaced by a financial shock. Individuals, people standing outside a system that is contracting around them, with fewer structures left to catch them. The roads are still there. The schools still stand. The hospitals are still open. But the people needed to sustain all of it are aging out, leaving, and not being replaced. No state government has a clean answer to that. Most states never have to ask the question. The next one on this list is asking a very different question. And the answer it's getting should be hard for anyone to hear. Number 9. Mississippi, where the nearest hospital is 2 hours away. Picture a 68-year-old retired teacher. Rural Mississippi. 40 miles outside the nearest town of any real size. She wakes up with chest tightness and shortness of breath. Calls for an ambulance. Paramedics arrive, stabilize her, and then tell her the nearest hospital with a functioning cardiac unit is 90 miles away. The local facility shut down 14 months ago. On rural roads, that's close to a 2-hour drive. That's not a hypothetical. It's a scenario playing out across rural Mississippi with increasing frequency and accelerating as closures continue. Mississippi already leads national rankings in nearly every negative health outcome. Highest rates of diabetes, highest rates of obesity, elevated rates of cardiovascular disease and stroke. The population most urgently in need of healthcare access is living in a state where that access is quietly being removed. Here's why it keeps getting worse. According to KFF, formerly the Kaiser Family Foundation, Mississippi tops the list of states facing extreme risk from potential federal Medicaid funding cuts. Medicaid isn't a side program here, it covers an enormous share of the population, including rural residents with no realistic path to private insurance. Rural hospitals without Medicaid expansion operate on margins so thin they're effectively negative, and the loop that creates has no natural exit. The patients who need care most are the ones hospitals lose the most money treating. The more they provide, the faster the finances deteriorate. When the money runs out, the hospital closes. When it closes, the community loses care. Health outcomes worsen. The burden shifts to the next facility. The cycle speeds up. This isn't a failure of any individual hospital or administrator. It's what happens when a healthcare financing model collides with the geography of rural poverty. And those two things are fundamentally incompatible, and the consequences reach beyond health. When a rural hospital closes, it's almost always the largest employer in town. The medical loss and the economic loss happen simultaneously. Jobs go. Local spending dries up. The basic infrastructure that makes a community viable for families disappears with it. Mississippi isn't heading toward this. It's already inside it. The next state hasn't lost its hospitals. It's losing something slower to notice, harder to measure, and much harder to get back. Number 8. Illinois, when a world-class city isn't enough. Here's a state that shouldn't be on this list. Chicago is one of the most economically powerful cities on earth. Finance, transportation, logistics, healthcare, manufacturing, world-class universities. One of the busiest airports on the planet. Illinois has every advantage that should produce a stable, thriving middle class. The kind of place people move toward, not away from. And the middle class is quietly leaving. Not dramatically, one family at a time. A couple from the suburbs who retire in Indiana after one too many property tax increases. A young professional who takes a job in Texas and doesn't come back. A small business owner who runs the numbers for the third year in a row and concludes they no longer work. Each decision looks like a personal choice. Collectively, they represent a state that has been losing net population for years, despite one of the country's most powerful urban economies. The driver isn't one catastrophic policy failure, it's an accumulation. Property taxes across many Illinois counties rank among the highest in the nation relative to home values. State income taxes have risen. Municipal pension obligations have created fiscal pressure that flows through to residents as higher fees and declining services. The cost of staying has been outpacing income growth long enough that it's starting to change behavior at scale. Then there's the homelessness figure, which catches most people off guard. According to HUD data from 2024, more than half of the homeless population in Illinois consists of families with children. One of the highest family homelessness proportions in the country, in a state with one of the country's strongest economies. And the jobs data makes it harder to explain away. People are working, but working a job in 2025 isn't what it was in 1995. Insurance rises, utilities rise, childcare rises, tuition rises. No single increase is a crisis. But compounded over years, they quietly erode the gap between financial stability and financial stress until that gap disappears. Illinois isn't the state that triggers alarm. It's the state that produces exhaustion, no single emergency to point to, just a trajectory that continues until one more family decides it's time to go. If you've found this useful so far, drop your state in the comments. I want to know if any of this matches what you're actually seeing. The next state's problem isn't invisible. It's visible on the streets of its largest city every day. And the gap between what this state says it stands for and what its data shows is one of the widest on this list. Number 7. Oregon. Good intentions, broken outcomes. Oregon spent decades building a very specific public identity. Environmental protection, progressive governance, a genuine, long-standing commitment to human dignity and social equity. Landmark policies on land use and social services that other states studied and tried to copy. In national conversations about livable, humane cities, Oregon is regularly cited as a model, which is exactly what makes the next number so hard to process. According to HUD data from 2024, 56% of homeless families with children in Oregon are unsheltered. Not in emergency shelters, not in transitional housing. Outside, in vehicles, in parks, in encampments. That percentage is the highest in the United States. A state that built its identity around human dignity is producing the worst unsheltered family homelessness outcomes in the country. That gap between the stated values and the actual data deserves more than a passing mention. The underlying causes aren't hard to identify, though they're worth being precise about. Oregon's housing supply has failed to keep pace with demand for an extended period. Zoning restrictions, construction costs, and long permitting timelines have constrained new housing in ways that push rental costs well beyond what lower and moderate income households can afford. At the same time, service delivery hasn't scaled in proportion to the visible, measurable growth in need. It's also worth noting this isn't the only cause. Rising housing costs, mental health gaps, and economic shifts are all part of a complex picture, but the pattern is consistent enough to name. The labor market adds pressure. As of January 2026, Oregon's unemployment rate was 5.2%, meaningfully above the national average of 4.3%. When jobs are harder to find and rents stay high, the margin between stability and crisis narrows for a much larger share of the population than most people realize. Oregon makes visible something uncomfortable regardless of where you land politically. Good intentions don't automatically produce good outcomes. Policy design, implementation quality, and honest measurement of results are what determine whether values actually translate into reality. A state can hold the right commitments and still produce the wrong results if the mechanisms for turning those commitments into action aren't built carefully and adjusted, honestly, when the data says they aren't working. The question Oregon forces is not whether the problem matters. It's whether the approach being taken is actually reducing it. The next state made its crisis nearly invisible, not by solving it, but by letting it go on long enough that people simply stopped recognizing it as a crisis at all. Number 6. Washington, the crisis that became wallpaper. There's a particular kind of failure that's harder to fix than an acute emergency. It happens when a problem persists long enough that society stops calling it a crisis. It doesn't get solved, it gets absorbed. And once that happens, the pressure to fix it quietly disappears with it. Washington State is living inside that process right now. Washington has the second highest number of chronically homeless individuals in the country, behind only California. Chronically homeless means continuously without housing for at least a year or repeatedly so across multiple years. These aren't people passing through a rough patch. They're stuck in a condition the system hasn't moved them out of. Nearly half of Washington's single homeless adults fall into that chronic category. For them, homelessness isn't something they're working through. It's just their life. And the costs compound. Chronic homelessness correlates with untreated mental illness, substance use, and serious physical conditions, all requiring intensive, expensive intervention. Emergency rooms absorb the healthcare burden. Law enforcement absorbs the mental health response. The bills grow every year, even as the underlying condition stays exactly the same. Washington also has some of the highest average wages in the country. Major technology companies. Strong GDP. That contrast is worth naming because it makes the situation harder to dismiss. Economic growth and entrenched homelessness aren't contradictions. They're a predictable result when growth concentrates among higher earners and never translates into affordable housing or mental health access for people who need it most. The turning point Washington may have already crossed is the one where tent encampments stopped making commuters pause. When a crisis becomes wallpaper, no one decides to give up on it. It just quietly stops being a priority. The next state isn't dealing with something invisible. The land itself is disappearing. Number 5. Louisiana, paying full price to live on disappearing ground. Louisiana is losing land, not through economic decline or population shifts, though both are happening. It's losing physical territory. The wetlands along the southern edge of the state are subsiding, eroding, and being reclaimed by the Gulf of Mexico at a rate with no modern American comparison. NOAA has projected that within the lifetime of a child born today, Louisiana could lose up to 800,000 acres of coastal wetlands. In some areas, the shoreline is expected to retreat inland by 33 miles. These aren't worst-case scenarios. They're based on observed land loss rates and measured sea level trends. The financial consequences are already arriving in the mail. Louisiana ranks among the states with the highest home and auto insurance premiums in the country by a wide margin. When the risk profile gets worse, storms intensify, natural buffers disappear, premiums don't inch up, they jump. In some parishes, major insurers haven't just raised rates. They've left entirely, forcing homeowners onto a state-backed carrier that is itself under financial strain. For lower and moderate income households, housing costs plus insurance plus utilities has become a weight that's genuinely hard to carry. Every renewal makes staying harder to justify. This isn't a story about bad decisions or wrong locations. These communities have existed for generations. The land loss was driven by a century of river engineering, decades of oil and gas extraction, and global processes Louisiana didn't cause and can't reverse alone. Louisiana shows what happens when nature starts raising the price of home. The next state shows what happens when a marketed paradise quietly starts sending a bill it never mentioned. Number 4. Florida, the fine print on the dream. Florida built one of the most effective relocation brands in American history. No state income tax. No brutal winters. Homes at prices that look genuinely accessible, especially for retirees leaving the Northeast and remote workers escaping high-cost cities. For years, that brand delivered exactly what it promised. The brand is still intact. The cost structure underneath it is not. Florida is now among the least affordable states in the country for homeowners insurance. Hurricane exposure is significant and well documented. As ocean temperatures rise, storm intensity follows. When insurers reassess that risk, they raise premiums, restrict coverage, or leave. In some counties, major national carriers have stopped writing new policies entirely, leaving homeowners on a state-backed insurer of last resort that is itself under pressure. That's the most visible cost. It isn't the only one. HOA fees across many Florida communities have risen sharply. Condominium associations, under regulations updated after a building collapse in 2021, must now fully fund maintenance reserves and complete deferred repairs on set timelines. For owners of older condos, that has meant assessments reaching tens of thousands of dollars with limited notice. Owning a condo in Florida today costs materially more than it did 5 years ago, for reasons that have nothing to do with choosing a better lifestyle. Florida's job market hasn't collapsed, but the unemployment rate has risen from its post-pandemic lows, and the sectors generating the highest wages aren't as dominant here as they are in states like Washington. Many jobs in Florida's services-heavy economy don't produce incomes that can absorb rising insurance, HOA fees, and utility costs at the same time. The result isn't collapse. It's a slow repricing of a lifestyle that was sold at one number and is now being sustained at a much higher one. For residents on fixed incomes or mortgages sized against older assumptions, that's not a future concern. It's a current monthly reality. Florida hasn't run out of sunshine. The invoice for living in it has just become substantially harder to read. The next two states are operating at a different scale entirely. And what they reveal should change how anyone thinks about the relationship between wealth and stability. Number 3, Arizona, building a future on borrowed water. Here's the version of Arizona that gets promoted: gleaming master-planned communities, new homes with 3-car garages, retirement resorts with golf courses and resort pools, population growth that outpaces nearly every other state year after year. By almost every conventional measure, Arizona looks like one of the clear success stories of modern American expansion. Now here's the version that doesn't appear in the promotional material. Arizona's key groundwater management areas established a formal safe yield target for 2025. Safe yield means don't extract more groundwater than rainfall can replenish. As a policy goal, that sounds reasonable. The problem is, Arizona has been in a drought stretching back to the early 1990s. Decades of below-average rainfall, combined with decades of aggressive population growth, means the gap between what the state pulls from the ground and what nature puts back has been widening for a very long time. By early 2026, the region was recording unprecedented heat events, accelerating evaporation and reducing the snowpack that feeds the surface water supply. Groundwater isn't an abstract policy issue. It's the water that comes out of the tap in the subdivisions sold to families as their version of the American dream. According to 2024 to 2025 census data, Arizona's growth composition has been quietly shifting. The state used to attract a significant share of international migrants, including skilled professionals in technology and aerospace. That's changed. Arizona now grows primarily through domestic in-migration, people relocating from other states. People are still arriving. But the economic character of that growth and the foundation supporting it is under increasing pressure. The core tension is structural. Arizona's suburban expansion model was designed for a water-abundant future that the hydrology of the American Southwest has never actually supported. You can build more subdivisions. You can zone more land. You can recruit more employers. What you cannot do is manufacture water when the aquifers supplying it are being depleted faster than they recover. An aquifer depletion isn't reversible on any timeline that matters to a homeowner or a city. Once the water table drops far enough, extraction costs rise, water quality often deteriorates, and some underground formations compact permanently, losing storage capacity even if conditions eventually improve. Arizona isn't collapsing under poverty. It's expanding aggressively on top of a resource base that cannot support that expansion indefinitely. The prosperity is real. The foundation beneath it is less stable than the sales pitch suggests. The next state isn't running short on water. It's running short on something less visible and far harder to recover once it's gone. Number 2. New York, where wealth and poverty share the same zip code. New York generates wealth on a scale that's genuinely hard to put into perspective. The financial sector moves volumes of capital that exceed the GDP of most countries. The Manhattan real estate market functions as a global store of value for the world's wealthiest individuals. By total economic output, New York ranks among the most productive places on the planet. None of that prevents it from having a homelessness rate of approximately 81 people per 10,000 residents, nearly 4 times the national average. According to HUD data from 2024, New York has the highest number of homeless families with children in the country, more than 95,000 people. Approximately 60% of the state's entire homeless population consists of families. Let that sit for a moment. Tens of thousands of children are growing up without stable housing inside the metropolitan area that generates more wealth per square mile than almost anywhere else on Earth. They're in shelter systems, in transitional programs, in hotels funded through emergency vouchers, in far worse situations, trying to attend school while navigating the daily instability of not having a consistent place to sleep. The mechanism producing this isn't hard to trace. New York's housing market is among the most constrained in the country relative to the size of its population and the strength of its economy. High construction costs, restrictive zoning, slow permitting, and a real estate market in which residential units serve as global investment vehicles have compressed the supply of affordable housing to a point where demand cannot come close to being met. The census data adds another layer. New York currently depends on international immigration to offset the outmigration of domestic residents. People who grew up in New York, built careers there, raised families there, are leaving at a rate that would reduce the state's population without a continuing inflow of newcomers. That reflects a judgment made by large numbers of people who know the state firsthand that the cost of staying has exceeded what they're willing or able to pay. New York exposes a fundamental flaw in how we measure economic success. GDP measures certain kinds of value creation. It doesn't measure distribution. It doesn't measure housing affordability. It doesn't count children sleeping in shelters. A state can perform at the top of every metric in a financial report and still fall short on the ones that determine whether ordinary people can build stable lives. New York isn't declining by any conventional economic measure. It's a place where prosperity and deprivation exist at extreme intensities, a few miles apart, produced and sustained by the same deeply embedded structural conditions. Which brings us to the final state, the one that takes every thread in this analysis and runs it at maximum scale. The one where all of this comes into the sharpest possible focus. Number 1. California, the wealthiest fracture in America. California is where the contradictions of the American economic model reach their fullest expression. Silicon Valley produced more wealth in the past 30 years than most countries have generated in their entire histories. Hollywood defines global culture. California's farms feed the nation. Its research universities produced a disproportionate share of the technologies shaping everyday life worldwide. By almost any measure of innovation and economic scale, California is exceptional. And California has an unemployment rate of approximately 5.4% above the national average. Domestic outmigration continues year after year as people calculate the cost of staying has become too high. Its homelessness rate stands at approximately 48 people per 10,000 residents, among the highest in the country. But the number that matters most on this list is one that rarely gets stated plainly. California accounts for 44% of the chronically homeless single individuals in the entire United States. Nearly half of the most entrenched homelessness problem in America is concentrated in one state. A state with a larger economy than most countries. A state that has directed billions of dollars toward this specific problem. A state whose political culture has consistently treated homelessness as an urgent crisis. The scale of that outcome, given the resources and the stated commitment, isn't easy to explain away. To be fair, homelessness in California involves many intersecting factors: housing costs, mental health infrastructure, substance use, and decades of underinvestment in social systems. But researchers broadly agree on the core driver. Housing production has lagged far behind demand for decades. When technology workers compete for the same constrained housing stock as nurses, teachers, and service workers, the outcomes for lower-income residents follow predictably. The insurance market is deteriorating here, just as it has in Florida and Louisiana. Major insurers are pulling back due to wildfire risk, creating coverage gaps and sharp premium increases even in high-value communities. California is losing domestic residents while continuing to attract international migrants, the same pattern as New York. The people who know the state from the inside are leaving. Those who see it from the outside still see the brand. That gap is itself a signal. California didn't arrive here through one concentrated failure. It arrived through decades of individually reasonable decisions that accumulated into a structural environment where an ordinary life has become very expensive, and where the systems producing expensive housing have consistently outrun the ones designed to make it accessible. What California represents in this analysis isn't the worst-case outcome. It's the most instructive one, because California has the resources, the talent, and the institutional capacity that most states don't. If this pattern were primarily a problem of poverty or limited capacity, California would be the exception. It isn't. It's the clearest example of the rule. A place can generate enormous wealth and still fail to provide stable lives for a large portion of its residents. And often, the processes that generate one also quietly generate the other. 10 states. 10 different combinations of causes, pressures, and conditions. But the pattern underneath all of them is consistent enough to name directly. Arizona is building on a water supply that cannot sustain its own expansion. Illinois is watching its middle class quietly decide the cost of staying is too high. Mississippi is losing the hospital infrastructure that makes rural communities viable. West Virginia is experiencing demographic contraction as a long-term structural condition, not a disruption. Oregon is producing the worst unsheltered family homelessness rates in the country despite its progressive commitments. Washington has allowed chronic homelessness to persist long enough that it feels like scenery. Louisiana is absorbing climate exposure, insurance deterioration, and fiscal fragility at the same time. Florida is discovering the lifestyle it marketed had a cost structure that was never fully disclosed. New York is generating extreme wealth and extreme deprivation in the same geography without the mechanisms to connect them. California is demonstrating that resources and ambition alone aren't enough to produce broadly livable conditions. None of these states are collapsing in any sudden, obvious way. The economy is running, institutions are functioning, people are working, paying bills, building lives. But the conditions under which a stable middle-class existence is achievable are narrowing. The margin for error is shrinking, and the number of people who are one job loss, one unexpected bill, or one health event away from real instability is growing steadily without announcement. That trajectory doesn't need a dramatic endpoint to matter. The slow erosion of economic security is its own kind of structural failure, even when it never produces a single moment that makes the front page. These 10 states aren't outliers. They're case studies, 10 versions of a broader pattern that exists in varying degrees across the country. The data doesn't lie. It also doesn't fix itself. If one of these states surprised you, or if you're living inside one and recognizing what was described, share it in the comments. The most important conversation about this isn't happening on the news, it's happening at people's own dinner tables.